Here's Mark's story as he talks about Jesus demonstrating his power over nature. And as evening came, read it with me. And as evening came, Jesus said to his disciples, "Let's cross to the other side of the lake." So they took Jesus in the boat and started out, leaving the crowds behind, although other boats followed. But soon a fierce storm came up. High waves were breaking into the boat, and it began to fill with water. Jesus was freaked out, running around the boat, screaming and yelling in fear of his life. Oh, wait. Jesus was asleep in the back of the boat with his head on a cushion. The disciples woke him up, shouting, "Teacher, don't you care? We're gonna die!" You know, as I'm reading through this, I'm thinking, sometimes people say, "I know it's the will of God. Everything just worked out perfectly." You with me? This worked out, that worked out. Well, I got some news for you. Sometimes, who was it who told them to go across the lake? It was Jesus. So they do what Jesus says, and the next thing you know, they're standing in the middle of the boat, up to their knees in water, and they're all going to die. This must not be the will of God. You have to hear from God and do what he says, and then what happens, happens. Are you with me? And when things go wrong, if you started under the leadership of God, it's still right. And if the waves start coming in, God is still there. You ever get into a crisis of life? God's there. It looks like you're going to lose it, God's there. Don't you care? That's another thing. How were they feeling at this time? They were absolutely freaked out, terrified, afraid. And when you're afraid, you also can doubt the love and care of God. Why does God tell us over and over again, 365 times, don't be afraid, don't sweat it, don't worry, I got it, relax, chill out. He keeps saying, don't be afraid, cool it. Why? If Satan can unnerve you and make you fearful, now he has an advantage over your thought processes where he can put doubt in your mind. That's why you don't start down the road of fear. And if your boat's going under, Jesus says, What? You think I suddenly lost the ability to float your boat? I just threw that in there. When Jesus woke, you guys are noisy, what? He rebuked the wind. He said to the waves, "Be silent." What it really said was, "Shut up." It's an involuntary command. Do what I say. Suddenly the wind stopped, and there was a great calm. Now, when I say Mark is showing the power of God in these three stories, there's connections in the three, and this is one of them, because when he stood at the head of the boat and he said, "Shut up," it's the same word he used when he spoke to the demonic in the Gerasenes. He said to the demons, "Shut up." I told my mom I could say that word anytime I wanted because Jesus said it. She never did buy that. She had a different translation. But he rebuked it, he yelled at it, and he used the same command to the nature as he did to the demons. So the wind stops. There's this great silence. A bunch of guys running around the boat full of adrenaline. Then he asked them, "Why are you afraid?" "Because we're going to die." "Do you still have no faith?" "Do you still not know who I am? Do you still not know the power that resides in me? Do you still not know that I am the most dominant force in the universe? Do you still not know that nothing can come against us that I can't overpower? Do you think there's ever a time when things are out of my control? Do you not know who I am? Why are you afraid? You still don't really believe in who I am. The disciples were absolutely terrified. Who is this man? They asked. Even the wind and the waves obey him. There's some stuff built in here that would be more obvious to them than it is to us. First of all, when Mark talks about whether it was Peter dictating to Mark, telling him what to write. This is a first-hand account. He talks about, we were leaving, we were teaching on the shore, and then Jesus says, let's go, so we went. There's a bunch of boats started after us, but they soon fell behind when we got into deep water. And then he describes the water was coming over the top of the boat and the boat. In other words, he's describing what he's experiencing, and he's in the middle of this thing telling Mark what to write. And then he says Jesus was in the back of the boat, and then he describes what he was sleeping on. It's the first-hand account. Jesus was in the back, laying on the coxswain cushion, and there he was asleep, we were freaked. And so this description is someone who is there telling us what happened. What was going on, among other things, was, and when he says, do you still not have faith? Do you still not get it? He actually said that to them quite a few times. You know, the disciples, some people would say disciples, but not me. The disciples ran to the back of the boat, and they said, don't you care? We're going to die. A little rude. And that was not, they quite often were less than polite to Jesus. Remember when just after this incident, the next thing Mark talks about is the lady who had the issue of blood. And they're going through the crowd, and he says, okay, who touched me? And the disciples say, really? Did you know, in the Middle East, they don't have space like we do. In Canada, there's a polite space which is about an arm's length. In the United States, you're a bit closer than that. And in Asia, and these people, countries where there's a lot more people, they're in your face. It's very uncomfortable. You know what I mean? Everybody sort of has a certain amount of space. And where he was in the Middle East, they had they were bumping and grinding up against each other, and it wasn't rude to push. And so everybody's pushing and shoving, and Jesus says, who touched me? And they say, dip squad. What do you mean? Everybody's touching you. And quite a few times they just didn't understand his level of perception. And a couple of times when he said, why don't you feed them? Yeah, right. On the wages you pay us, it'd take 5 years to buy enough for them. And there's another time when Jesus actually had to rebuke them. And so they would say something stupid to Jesus, and he would say, guys, get your act together. Know what you're looking at, know who I am, and know of my power. They were traveling down the road once, and Jesus said, be careful of the yeast of the Pharisees. There's a way of thinking which will seep into you, which will destroy you. And he said, don't even start that way of thinking. And so, them being the wise, perceptive men that they are, he must be talking about we didn't bring any bread. Philip, you're in charge of bread. Not me, man. That's not me. That was John's job. And so they're arguing back and forth about who forgot the bread. And Jesus says, look, guys, and he makes them answer this question. When I fed the 5,000, how many loaves were left over? How many baskets of food were left over? We fed the 4,000. How much was left over? Do you not get it? I have no problem with food. And so he kind of, every once in a while, would say, are you guys for real? Get with a program here. This kind of stuff is not hard for me. And the other thing that's happening here is these guys and that nation have been taught from little kids that there's only one person that can control nature, and in particular water, and that was God. In the Psalm 65, it says, you quieted the raging ocean with their pounding waves, and you silenced. And so they had learned from memory work about this God. And in Psalm 89, he says, you rule the ocean, you subdue their storm-tossed waves. And he goes on, he says, some went off to the ships in the sea, and the Lord's actions and rose, the winds rose and stuff like that. And so they had learned that God controls weather and nature. And if he holds back the rain from the earth, it will become a desert. If he releases water, it will flood. They talk about the Red Sea, and God controlled it. And so when this guy, Jesus, stepped to the front of the boat and commanded that nature obey his voice, he was saying, I am God. Because only God controls nature. Some cults will say that Jesus never said he was God. He said it quite a few times in both action and plainly in words. Here, he took something that they all knew to be true, only God controls nature, and he did something only God could do. The other time, he forgave sins. He said, you guys have said that only God can forgive sins. He also teaches that if they have not forgiven sins, then they won't be healed. So I said forgive sins, and if I'm not God, and if I can't forgive sins, then he won't be healed. Oh, by the way, stand up and be healed. He was saying, I am God. I can forgive sins. I am God. I command nature. And even once he said, before Abraham was, I am. There's only one person who's I am, and that's Jehovah God. He was saying over and over again to the guys, you absolutely need to chill out because I am God in the flesh, on the earth, and nothing is out of my control. You with me? He's saying if you knew who I was, you would never fear. If you knew the extent of my power, you would never worry. If you knew what I'm going to place in you, you would realize that you will never be defeated from that day through eternity. If you knew that I control the past, the present, and the future, the spirit world, the weather, and everything that was created has to obey me, you would understand that you are children of the living God, and at my word nature yields, but at my word you have become a new creature, and all of who I am will be in you. He's saying to you and to me, if you understand who we are, what we have been given, and who our Father is and what he has given us, there is never any reason to fear. What in Jeremiah, I think it's 32, I think I put it in there, and it says, is there anything too difficult for God? What are you looking at? What are you facing? What are you worrying about? It's kind of an insult to God to worry. It's kind of like this. They're going to drown, the boat's going under, they know they're going to die, they're fishermen, and they understand the difference between a boat that floats and a boat that sinks. They're not done, and they're going to sink. And he says, and you're afraid of this? Yes! Do you think that I can't handle a storm? No, you're sleeping. There is nothing in your life that he can't handle. Is there anything too great for God? Come on. Never, ever should we worry. I don't worry. That's Teresa's job. I'm in the back of the boat sleeping. Why does she worry? Because she has to fix it. Did anyone come in this morning with a worry? You don't think it's going to turn out? Are you with me? You really don't think it's going to turn out? You really don't think that God can handle this? You can't. We all know that. Probably shouldn't have been trying so hard. Should have let go and let God. This morning, his rebukes to the disciple were always, what in the world were you worried about? Do you know who I am? And to you and to me this morning he says, why in the world would you worry? Do you not know who you are and who lives in you? This was meant to be an epiphany. One of those, whoa. And it worked. At the end they said, what did he just do? And the question is rhetorical. Who is this man? And the answer is, he's Jesus Christ, the Messiah, the one who's been promised for thousands of years. And then he said, not only am I the Messiah, I am God on the face of the earth, coming to redeem my people as I promised I would do. I have set you free from any power, including death. He walked in to that dead little girl, and he said, not only nature, not only spirit world, I have power over the last enemy, which is death and hell. So why doesn't he do that today? Anybody heard that? Why doesn't God do stuff today? Why don't we see this stuff today? A guy that I've gotten to know, maybe I suspect some of you guys know him. It's James Crowley. He's an eye surgeon. He does cataract surgery and stuff like that. He wrote a book called Believing is Seeing. And basically what he's saying, you don't see what is, you see what you believe. Which means, physically, you have twice as many signals running from your brain to your eyes, telling you what to see, than you do from your eyes to your brains, telling you what you saw. You and I are not authorized or equipped or created by God to judge. Why? Because you don't know what just happened. You saw what your brain told you to see. Say, amen. Why don't you see miracles? You only see what you believe. You don't believe because you see. You with me? That's why Craig, is it? Says, we got a discipleship course, and he says, everything that we know and understand comes by the revelation of God. Why? Because until you're touched by God to believe, you cannot see. We think we see, and it makes our belief. I'm not going to do it this morning, but it's very easy to prove that you don't see what is. And yes, it's entertaining. And if I were to talk to you one-on-one, well, that's everybody else, but I see everything. Yeah, right. You don't. And science spends a lot of time and money entertaining themselves, making you believe that what you saw was real and it's really not. Why? Because we don't see what is. We just don't see what is. We decide what we think it is, and then we believe from our predisposition. Are you with me? So, you know, which one of you guys was talking about pulling your plug this morning? Which one of you guys? You? Yeah, you look like you've been dead for a while, too. It's kind of a little washed out, a little pale. Actually, you're not looking bad today, so you must have had a complete recovery.
We had victory in Jesus.
Ah, this Jesus guy again. His name's coming up all over the place. How inconvenient is that? He did this same trick to Lazarus, and they said, we got to kill this guy because he raised Lazarus from the dead, and everybody's following. They didn't fight with the fact he brought him back from the dead. They never did fight with the fact that his miracles were real. They were just freaked out that everybody was following this carpenter who claimed to be God. Now, you had life restored. How that is observed, depends on what you believe. You with me? Since I don't believe people come back to life, you were never dead. So there. That was easy. There is no Jesus, and I don't have to deal with that stuff because it never happened. Whew, that was close. almost, for a minute there, I almost had to admit there was a God. Whew, thank goodness. Billy, could you come up and talk to me for a minute? Cash Crouch is an engineer who went here. Billy and I have been friends for a long time. My first Sunday in this church, Lynette and him stood up and I married them. And Bill has never forgiven me for that, but hi, Lynette. I have watched Bill and Lynette for 22, 23 years. We were as good looking then as we are now. So I've had the chance to watch his life. Does that make sense? And people can put on a show, but they screw up after a couple decades. They just can't maintain the front. Are you with me? I've got to the place where I trust Bill and Lynette, and they've been through the valley in the shadow of death, and felt like hell. It wasn't. It was just a precursor. And they crawled back up out of the hole, shook themselves off, still kind of recovering. That was a pretty bad deal. But when they got their senses about them again and could refocus, it was on God they looked to. You with me? And nothing can shake you and separate you from the love of God. And I watched it. And so, Bill, love you. Glad you're here. But now, Cash Crouch, who's an engineer who set the lumen standard when you go into any school or any public building or any government office or any mall, he's the engineer that set how many lumens the light has to be set at and the standard. Brilliant man. And his son was called Doug. Unfortunately, Doug died. Tell us about it, Bill.
Well, what about the testimony of Eddie this morning?
Yeah.
This same Jesus that brought Eddie back, brought back a friend's son of mine. Cash Crouch was a member of a prayer team we had in this church. Met at 6:30 on Tuesday mornings and Thursday mornings. And he had a son who had wandered away from God. He asked if I would pray with him for that son to return. I said, sure, how you want to do it? He said, well, we don't even have to be together because God has no distance measurement. You and I will each agree to pray at 8:30 on Saturday morning for my son to be returned to God. And we did this for a couple weeks, and nothing was happening. So one morning I said to the Lord, I said, okay, God, you're in charge of this, whatever it takes. Bring this man back to Jesus. Because his father's been faithful. We're praying for him, and we know you answer prayer. Well, wouldn't you know, 2 weeks later, Doug Crouch, Cash's son, laying on the floor of his second-story apartment in Brooklyn, dead with a massive heart attack.
God spoke to you first, though, Billy.
Yes, he did. He told me, and I'm sorry, I skipped over that. One morning when I was praying, God spoke to me and said, it's going to be okay. It's going to get ugly. It's going to be okay. I said, well, what does that mean? He said, it's going to get ugly, but it's going to be okay. And you call Cash Crouch right now and tell him that. Well, okay. So I called Cash, and through my tears and my sobbing, I managed to tell him, it's going to get ugly, Cash, but it's going to be okay. 2 weeks later, Doug's laying dead on his floor in the apartment in Brooklyn. Massive heart attack, 23 minutes without oxygen to the brain. Kind of like Eddie. The same God that raised him up is in charge of our lives if we trust and believe. At any rate, they got him to the hospital, got him revived, put him on the machines, as with Eddie. Machine moving his breathing, machine running his heart. But he has no brain activity. Absolutely flat-lined. 6 weeks he laid there in that bed. Machine's keeping him alive, but zero brain activity, not even a slight spike. So they called the family together and told them they needed to unplug him, because even if he revived, he would be a vegetable. There's no chance. His brain's just too damaged. Cash called me up and says, Bill, didn't God tell you that he's going to be okay? I said, what God said was, it's going to get ugly, but it's going to be okay. He said, okay, that does it for me. If God's in control, he doesn't need my help. The family came together and decided they were going to unplug him. So they did. They unplugged him, and the dummy kept breathing. His heart kept beating. And you know, in 30 minutes, he sat up in that bed. Says, I'm hungry. I want to go home.
Yeah.
Our big problem in life is not God or his lack of power or his power. Our big problem is we don't understand who we are. We don't understand that when Jesus died on the cross, he arranged for the Spirit to be put in you that raised him from the dead. The same power that raised him, that raised Doug Crouch, lives in you if you've accepted Christ. Can't we learn to believe that? Can't we let go and let God, as David was saying? There's nothing impossible to him. He will see us through whatever comes. And as my wife often says, what's the worst going to happen? I die and go to heaven. What's so bad about that? That's who we serve, people. That's who God wants you to know. He says, go and make disciples. Preach the gospel, make disciples. What's a disciple? Definition of disciple? A learner. You want to learn about Jesus? Become a disciple. We in this church are going to help you do that.
Thanks, Billy. When I say you see what you believe, possible to say, Eddie, they don't know what they're talking about. Part of the story that Bill left out was when Cash Crouch says, God said he was going to be okay. Yep, well, that's okay for me. Cash was not letting them pull the plug because God had told them Doug would come. You know what I mean? Do I understand that? And they put so much pressure on him. Why? Because he was dead, that's why. These are scientists, doctors, have him hooked up, he's flatlined, nothing's working, he is dead. As we know, dead. What you see is not what happened, what you see is what you believe. You see Eddie dead if you believe there's a spirit world. If you don't, bunch of dumbest doctors I ever saw in my life. Can't tell whether a person's dead or alive. And this happens over and over again, there's other stuff, but